Well, welcome everyone. My name is Frank Fear for Mountaineer Locker Room then and now. And we just love the Mountaineers. We love talking about what's going on. Currently, the 2024 season, we're taping this in August, is just right around the corner. But there is a then. In other words, the Mountaineers of yesteryear. And we just love talking with former players who played for the Mountaineers back in the day from the 1950s on. And today, this is the second in a series of looking at players who played for the great Pappy Lewis. When I think my opinion is West Virginia football really got on the national map when Pappy Lewis came to Morgantown. And so we're very pleased to have with us today Jim Peyton from Wheeling, who didn't start, and we're going to talk about this, who didn't start at WVU. He started at Army and played there and then transferred at West Virginia. So, Jim, it is an absolute pleasure to see you, assisted here by Nancy Kadar, who's Jim's next door neighbor, and you live in Wheeling, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Yes, very good. And like so many of the players, all the players we've talked with, not only did you have a great career at West Virginia, but you had a great career afterwards. Could you talk a bit about what you did after you graduated your business career, engineering, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I worked for Texaco and I did um, mechanical work. Uh, we had, I started at Port Arthur and continued with Texaco, worked at several different locations, all types of mechanical equipment. And
You had a great career after playing at WVU. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the 1950s teams and the great teams that played under Pappy Lewis, Jim played in 1952 and 1953 at West Virginia. And those teams, when you think about it, and let me just say a few words about history, Jim, you know this, is that when you look at West Virginia football back in the day, there were good teams here and there. The 1922 team, first team that really went to a bowl game, that was an outstanding team. Was essentially undefeated 10-0 and 1 under the great Clarence Spears. And there were other teams in the 30s and so on and so forth. But what I think is really interesting about the Mountaineers back in the day is that if you look from 1930 to 1949, that's almost 20, that's 20 years. West
you know,
Virginia only had seven winning teams. And the best was the 1948 team, probably, I would say the best, went 9-3 and played in the Sun Bowl. But when you got there, Jim, things turned around. The 50 season was so-so, 51 so-so. But when you came on in 1952, that season was an incredible season. And what's interesting about that, losing two of the first three games to Furman in the opener, and then Penn State, then winning six in a row, and then going on to beat Pitt, to beat Virginia Tech, to beat South Carolina at South Carolina. And boy, were you surrounded with incredible players. Just a few here. Freddie Wyant, quarterback, Gene Lathy, guard, Bobby Moss, Joe Marconi, both running backs, Dick Nicholson, Jack Rabbits, Eddie Dugan, those were also running backs. Obviously, the great Sam Huff, Bruce Bosley, Joe Patetti, Bill Underdonk. Our first show, we had Jill Underdonk on talking about her dad. Bill Hillen, who was featured with he was an end. He from Pennsylvania was featured in a Life magazine story with Pappy Lewis. So how did you get to West Virginia? Did Pappy Lewis recruit you? And then say a few words about Pappy Lewis himself.
yeah, Pappy, we were recruited by Pappy. We had great teams, and we had don't kid yourself. The internal players from West Virginia were very good, and you mentioned a few of them, and of course, Huff, Bosley, Wyant.
Yeah, I'm going to say I forgot to mention Gene Lamone, other guy who was a great ball player.
Yeah, Gene's still living.
Yeah, as far as I know, it's Gene Lathy, you, and Gene Lamone. Gene Lamone is living in Florida. Gene Lathy is still living in West Virginia, as you are. There may be others, but those are the three that we know from the 52, 53, and so on years that are still surviving.
Is that right?
Mm.
Yeah, and Chuck Halley just died, and Chuck was part of the team, and that I think that his legacy lived on.
Yeah.
I
He was,
congratulate him for his career.
it's interesting because a lot of those guys like Huff and Howley, when I tell people they played at West Virginia, they go, "Wow, they didn't know that." They just remember them from their great professional careers, and yet, as you all know, there were great players on that team that didn't play or didn't play very long in the NFL. And Freddie Wyant ended up to be just an incredible NFL official for a very long time. So he made his mark in the NFL as an official, not a player.
Yeah, he did. And Freddie was as good a quarterback as you find, and
Wow.
he was left-handed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that was rather unique.
Yeah. And of course, you guys back then will always be known as the first and only. And then you guys went on in 1953 and had a different season from 1952 in the sense, as I mentioned, in 52 you lost the first two out of three. In 1953, you started with 7 wins in a row, and then that got you to the Sugar Bowl, and then lost to Georgia Tech. What a great team that was! And again, that was the year that started the three-peat against Penn State.
That's correct. The thing that I still don't understand is how we lost that game. We had better personnel than Georgia Tech. I still think that, at our assistant coaches, Ed Shockey,
Oh,
Russ Crane, Gene Corm, we had pretty good guys, and I anyhow we
yeah.
lost.
Yeah, and one reason may have been, it's awfully difficult for a team or in almost any sport that hasn't had a lot of consistent success to go out there the first time and win a big game. As I said, you guys, the team had been to the Sun Bowl in 48. There were very few bowls back then. People need to recognize that there are only a handful of bowls, not like it is today with I know you still watch a lot of sports, but there are like 44 or 45 bowl games these days. But back then, you could have a very good season and not go to a bowl game. And so it was great that West Virginia got there to get that bid to play Georgia Tech. And one of the tidbits about that Georgia Tech game is that the punter for Georgia Tech was Jim Carlin, who later became head coach at West Virginia. He was Georgia Tech's punter.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not
Yep.
amazing. Shows you how
Yeah, it
things
is.
that can can turn around. But you didn't start at West Virginia. You and Bob Orders, who went on to become an All-American, and he's in the WVU Hall of Fame too, from Huntington. Both of you went to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and that must have been late 40s or early 50s. Did you start at Army?
Yeah, I got out of high school in 49. So I started in 49.
Wow.
Yeah. And we had 44 out of 45 guys that were on the A squad at Army that got kicked out.
For those who are not familiar with the story, Army was quite the team back in the day with Coach Red Blake. Their games against Notre Dame and back in the day in the 40s were legendary. I mean, we can't think about Army as a top tier football program today. The game has changed, institutions changed, priorities, but back in the day they were national champions multiple times, had great teams, great players, and there was a cheating scandal at the academy because a lot of eyes were on Army, and essentially the entire team was dismissed from the academy, and so then they did a pivot and still had great teams back then, back in the day, and then you and Bob transferred to West Virginia from there, correct?
That's correct.
What was your evaluation of Pappy? What stood out to you in terms of his coaching skills, abilities, and his leadership?
Well, his leadership was unquestionable. He just had that attitude about him about being a big coach, and he was that. I think he was when Mississippi State, some play.
Yeah, he came to. I'm glad you
He,
brought. Yeah, he came from Mississippi State as a line coach after he was at Washington and Lee as head coach. And the other thing, you may know this, that Pappy Lewis is still the youngest head coach in NFL history.
I
Uh,
didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, when he was with the Browns after, well, they're the Browns now, but the Cleveland Pro team after World War II. I think he was like 34, 33 as a head coach. He coached for about 5 or 6 games. But yes, you're right. He came from Mississippi State.
One of our coaches was Vince Lombardi, and Lombardi was coach the 2 years that I was there. Lombardi taught me to pull, and I was a pulling guard, and I weighed 185 pounds. And when I transferred, Lewis was a power guy.
As I said earlier, Jim, these names aren't just for a time; they last forever. They're in the annals of history forever. It's just incredible. Uh,
Well, you know, there were just good football coaches back then. They had the basics, and of course, compared with now, there's so many.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And West Virginia had, Greasy Neal, Rat Rogers, Clarence Spears, and arguably the best of them all, or certainly in the top, never coached at West Virginia. That's Ben Schwartzwalder, who was the center, I believe, back in the 30s for WVU. And talk about size. I don't know if he was more than 150 pounds playing center. And then went on, I think he coached at Albright, but he's known forever for the great things he did at Syracuse.
Yeah,
and won a national championship, I think in '59. Recruited incredible players. The great Jim Brown, he recruited Ernie Davis, those great running backs. And the guys still talk about uh, players of the '70s going to Syracuse and playing against the Syracuse Orange, who were big, tough, mean, and no matter whether they won or lost, they knew they were in a heck of a game because these guys were just monsters of the midway, so to speak. I mean, Ben Schwartzwelder put together one hell of a program at Syracuse.
he did. And well, it proves that his record.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about today a bit. I know you watch. Nancy mentions you do a lot of viewing of sports, which is great. Have a nice TV in
Yeah,
your man cellar there. Do you follow the Mountaineers much these days?
yeah, I've followed. By the way, I like the new coach. I think he's got it together finally,
Yeah, I
from
agree.
what I'm reading. And I just read an article here in the paper the past couple of days where he's in the psychological part of football.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jim, you bring that up because in talking with former players, and I'm going to say sort of history repeats, is that a lot of the former players say, that there was a parallel between Pappy Lewis and Jim Carlin. uh, Pappy Lewis was extroverted, went out and met people, sold WVU football, and Jim Carlin did the same thing when he came from Georgia Tech in the mid '60s. And they're saying the same thing about Neil Brown, that people are saying, players are saying, boy, does he remind me of Bobby Bowden. You're right, the full package, not just on the field, but he knows the kinds of players he wants to recruit, character guys who are willing to take coaching, who are team players, who are not just about themselves. And, I always tell people, and I say this on the show regularly, I really love watching his press conferences because they're clinics. He has really, really become an outstanding coach and can express it. That's the thing. A lot of coaches can't express it as well as Neil Brown does. So I agree with you. A lot of us are just we're rooting for him to be successful.
Well, I think he's the kind of coach that considers every little bit of football and every aspect of it. He doesn't just get the big guys and gets out. I mean, look at the Gallagher. He's only in his second year. It's another part of his coaching.
Yep,
He doesn't. He brings him along slowly.
that's right. Oh, he
And
talked about that the other day, Jim, that he said, we're now getting ready to see which players will start against and play a lot against Penn State on the 31st of August. But he said, we're going to bring along these other players. They may not be ready now, but come October, November, they will be. So in that way, he reminds me of another coach I'm familiar with, and that's Mark D'Antonio, who just got into the Hall of Fame. He would bring in 3 stars and 2 stars and develop them. People like Le'Veon Bell, Kirk Cousins, were not highly recruited out of high school, and he brought them in and he developed them. And Neil Brown's doing the same thing. And boy, that's wonderful. I mean, look at Hudson Clement. I mean, he wasn't. He came in as a preferred walk-on, and there's every reason to believe if he doesn't start, he will be in the front line of the receiving corps and probably also on special teams, returning punts and kickoffs this year. So I agree with you 100%. Jim, any
yeah,
final comments that you want to make about your playing time, or any comment that you want to make about college football today?
the big guy is not as dominant as it was. I think it's being turned over to the skilled players. And I'm glad. Um, I'm a small guy, and I just think it gives a small guy a chance.
Mm,
And
yeah,
I think that the smaller guy is it starting to dominate.
yeah, I agree. You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. If you're not the only person from your immediate family that played at West Virginia. Bob played for the Mountaineer baseball team in the 1960s.
Yeah, Bob is my cousin. He and his other his brother uh, was trainer for the Atlanta Braves,
Wow.
and he has a PhD, and so he contributed it, and he's still living, and he's living down in Texas.
Wow. And all from Wheeling?
Yeah,
Wow. Fantastic. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for taking the time and Nancy Kadar again for arranging this. She is Jim's neighbor in Wheeling to have a chance to introduce fans to Jim Peyton and uh, his role at West Virginia football many decades ago, 1952, 53. And Jim, God bless you and thank you for spending time with us. And we all want the Mountaineers to be successful. And I'm sure you're going to be watching the games here in a few weeks, and we'll be rooting for the Mountaineers.
yeah. I had season tickets for many years, and no longer going to be going
Yeah,
that way. So,
yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank,
Thank you, Nancy. And
thank you, Frank. It's been a pleasure.
well, we appreciate it. This is Frank Fear for Mountaineer Locker Room Then and Now. Thanks for joining us, and take care.